Slavery began in the earliest known civilizations. Evidence of slavery appears in Mesopotamia over 5,000 years ago. It classified slaves as property, but included regulations regarding their treatment. Slaves could be inherited, bought, or sold. Some could marry and own limited property. Children of slaves were usually born into slavery. In the Sumerian city-states, individuals could become slaves through war, debt, or punishment. Slaves were often prisoners of war or criminals. They worked in agriculture, households, and ritual sacrifice. Biblical texts dating back to the 2nd millennium before the birth of Christ include references to both Hebrew and foreign slaves. By the 5th century before the birth of Christ, Athens relied heavily on slave labor. Enslaved people worked as domestic servants, miners, artisans, and agricultural workers. Enslaved individuals were acquired through conquest, piracy, birth, or debt. They worked in mines, on farms, in homes, and in public administration. Slaves were obtained through war, trade, and raiding. The Abbasid Caliphate used African slave labor in large-scale agricultural projects in southern Iraq. The Zanj Rebellion, which began in 8690 after the birth of Christ, was a major uprising of enslaved Africans. It lasted nearly 15 years and required substantial military force to suppress. They worked in households, tended animals, and served their owners. Slaves were acquired through war and trade and served in households, agriculture, and military support. Slavery was regulated by law and included rules for manumission. Byzantine society drew slaves from Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, and the Islamic world. Slaves were captured in West and Central Africa and transported north across the desert to North Africa and the Mediterranean. Enslaved individuals were relocated across the empire, serving Mongol elites and contributing to economic expansion. The Mongol conquests facilitated a transcontinental movement of slaves between Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. These slaves, known as thralls, worked in homes and on farms. The Viking slave trade extended to markets in the Middle East and Byzantium. Thralls could be inherited and sometimes freed. European powers, including Portugal, Spain, England, France, and the Netherlands, captured or purchased enslaved Africans and transported them across the Atlantic Ocean. Conditions were overcrowded and unsanitary. Enslaved individuals were chained below deck, fed minimally, and denied basic hygiene. Mortality rates were high. Millions of Africans died during the crossing. These voyages formed part of the triangular trade, in which manufactured goods from Europe were exchanged for slaves in Africa, who were then shipped to the Americas, and colonial goods were returned to Europe. The first recorded arrival of enslaved Africans in Virginia occurred in 1619. The trade was sustained by European demand for colonial products and by African intermediaries who participated in the capture and sale of slaves. Enslaved Africans resisted through revolt, escape, and the formation of independent communities. Enslaved individuals were sold and transported from the Upper South to the Deep South to work on cotton plantations. Slavery expanded rapidly in the southern colonies and was supported by legal codes that defined enslaved people as property. Denmark abolished slavery in its colonies in 1848. The Netherlands followed with abolition in 1863. Spain gradually abolished slavery in its colonies, ending it in Puerto Rico in 1873 and Cuba in 1886. It freed over 700,000 enslaved people in the Caribbean. Slaveholders were compensated, not the enslaved. A system of apprenticeship required many of the freed individuals to work temporarily for their former owners before gaining full liberty. Serfs were legally bound to landowners and owed them labor or payments. In 1861, Tsar Alexander II issued the Emancipation Edict, freeing more than 20 million serfs. Anti-slavery laws were imposed by colonial administrations. However, forced labor and exploitative practices continued under colonial rule. Colonial governments conscripted Africans for road building, mining, and plantation work without proper compensation. The reform allowed serfs to own land and marry without permission, but many remained economically dependent and impoverished. Enslaved individuals had no legal rights and could be subjected to physical punishment, family separation, and lifelong bondage. political prisoners and ordinary citizens accused of disloyalty may be sentenced to labor camps, where they work in agriculture, mining, or manufacturing under harsh conditions. Escapees have provided evidence of severe abuse and forced labor across generations. Slaves came from Africa, Eastern Europe, and the Caucasus. From the 1930s through the 1950s, millions of prisoners were sent to labor camps for political or criminal offenses. The League of Nations addressed slavery in the 1920s and 1930s. Article 4 of the Declaration outlawed all forms of slavery. The ILO Forced Labor Convention of 1930 defined forced labor and required governments to abolish it. The 1957 Abolition of Forced Labor Convention strengthened these commitments. Armed groups have used child soldiers in countries such as the Democratic Republic of Congo and Somalia. Forced marriage also remains a widespread issue in parts of West and East Africa. The Slavery Convention of 1926 defined and condemned slavery globally. It was followed by a supplementary convention in 1956. It defines human trafficking and outlines legal standards for victim protection and international cooperation. Most UN member states have signed the protocol. This includes about 25 million in forced labor and 15 million in forced marriage. The index uses data from the International Labour Organization and national surveys. Brazil operates mobile enforcement teams to identify and rescue people in slave-like conditions. Thousands of people have been freed through these operations. Activists and organizations track labor practices in global supply chains. Companies are encouraged to audit their suppliers and publish transparency reports. Thanks for stopping by the podcast. Subscribe so you don't miss our next one. Victims are exploited in prostitution, domestic service, and low-wage industries. Traffickers use coercion, fraud, and threats to control victims. Governments have passed laws and launched investigations to dismantle trafficking networks. They worked in construction, logging, mining, and infrastructure projects. Victims are coerced by threats or deception. Unlike historical slavery, modern slavery is often illegal but hidden. Many died due to poor conditions, cold, and starvation. Migrant workers may be trapped by recruitment fees, withheld passports, and threats. Victims often cannot leave due to debt or fear. They worked in households, harems, and military service. The empire issued laws to limit and eventually end the slave trade. However, bonded labor emerged as a major issue. In bonded labor systems, individuals work to repay debts under exploitative conditions. Under this system, workers are legally tied to their employers. Many face passport confiscation, non-payment of wages, and restrictions on movement. International pressure has led to reforms, but abuses continue. This practice has persisted in rural areas of India, Pakistan, Nepal, and Bangladesh, despite legal prohibitions. The practice declined and was formally abolished in the early 1900s. Sugar, tobacco, cotton, and coffee plantations relied heavily on slave labor. Escaped enslaved people and free black activists played key roles. Harriet Tubman helped hundreds escape through the Underground Railroad. Iran abolished slavery in 1929. Saudi Arabia formally abolished slavery in 1962. Mauritania declared slavery illegal in 1981 and passed laws criminalizing it in 2007. Despite these legal changes, some hereditary forms of slavery and domestic servitude have continued in practice. Frederick Douglass spoke and wrote about his experience in bondage. In the Caribbean and Brazil, enslaved populations experienced high mortality, requiring constant importation of new slaves. The practice was abolished officially in the early 1900s following the fall of the Qing Empire. However, systems of forced labor were later reintroduced during political campaigns, including under the People's Republic of China. In 1863, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which declared enslaved people in Confederate states to be free. Brazil had imported more enslaved Africans than any other country. In the 1870s, Brazil passed gradual reforms, including the Free Womb Law in 1871, which declared children born to enslaved mothers to be free. On May 13, 1888, Brazil passed the Lei Áurea, or Golden Law, abolishing slavery completely. Brazil was the last country in the Western Hemisphere to abolish legal slavery. In 1865, the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution formally abolished slavery throughout the United States. This trade included men, women, and children who served in households, armies, and agricultural labor. Slaves were often prisoners of war or criminals. Over time, the majority of unfree labor transitioned into serfdom. Portuguese traders established fortified trading posts and began acquiring enslaved Africans. In 1804, Haiti declared independence and abolished slavery. It became the first independent black republic in the Americas and the only successful large-scale slave revolt in world history. In 1787, British abolitionists formed a group to petition Parliament and end the slave trade. In 1807, the British Parliament passed the Slave Trade Act, which made it illegal for British ships to engage in the slave trade. The British Royal Navy began patrolling the Atlantic, intercepting slave ships and freeing their human cargo. These individuals were transported to Europe and to island colonies such as Madeira and the Azores. By the 17th century, serfdom had become the dominant system of labor control in Russia, though formal slavery remained legal until the 18th century. These slaves were sold across the Mediterranean and used in domestic service, workshops, and agriculture. Slave caravans traversed thousands of miles and connected sub-Saharan Africa with Islamic markets. By the late 15th century, both Spain and Portugal began transporting African slaves to the Americas, following the colonization of the New World. This marked the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade. The arrival of Islam in the 7th century, after the birth of Christ, brought religious regulations to slavery. Arab traders purchased enslaved people from coastal regions, such as present-day Kenya, Tanzania, and Mozambique. Christian doctrine increasingly opposed the enslavement of fellow Christians. However, non-Christians could still be enslaved. In many regions, slavery was gradually replaced by serfdom, a form of labor where peasants were bound to the land and obligated to serve landowners. Serfs could not be bought or sold individually, but were subject to legal and economic control. Slaves were shipped across the Indian Ocean to Arabia, Persia, and India. They served in households as laborers and as soldiers. This trade continued for centuries and expanded under the Sultanate of Zanzibar. The Quran permitted slavery but urged fair treatment and encouraged manumission. Slavery continued in Islamic societies for centuries and included both domestic and military service. Educated slaves could be employed as teachers, doctors, or scribes. Roman law allowed slaves to be freed through a formal process called manumission. Freed slaves could become Roman citizens, but most remained in bondage for life. By the 1st century after the birth of Christ, slaves made up a significant percentage of the population in Italy and throughout the empire. Most were non-Greeks captured in war or acquired through trade. Slaves in Athens had no political rights and were considered property under the law. Some could be freed and even gain limited legal status. Hebrew slaves could be freed after a fixed period of service. Foreign slaves could be held permanently. Laws in the Book of Exodus and Deuteronomy addressed treatment, injury, and manumission. Slavery continued into later dynasties, including the Zhou and Han. Chinese legal codes recognized slaves as property, but some slaves were able to buy their freedom or be freed by their masters. The helots were not personal property like chattel slaves, but were bound to the land and forced to farm for their Spartan overlords. Helots greatly outnumbered the Spartan population and were kept in submission through systemic violence, surveillance, and state-sponsored terror. Many African societies used slavery as part of internal social structures. Individuals could become slaves through warfare, debt, or as punishment for crime. Slavery in these societies varied widely. Some slaves held positions of trust and could marry or earn freedom. In others, slaves were treated as property and passed down through inheritance. War captives and criminals were enslaved. Slaves worked in households, quarries, farms, and construction projects. Some scholars believe forms of coerced labor may have existed, though direct evidence of slavery is inconclusive. Later Indian societies clearly practiced slavery. Ancient Indian texts such as the Artha Shastra, from around 300 before the birth of Christ, mention slaves and outline rules for their treatment and manumission. Slaves in Egypt could sometimes acquire property or earn their freedom. Egyptian society distinguished between different types of servitude, including debt servitude and chattel slavery. Slaves worked in households, temples, and agricultural fields. Records from the 3rd millennium before the birth of Christ describe laws regulating slave ownership and compensation for injury to slaves. The Code of Hammurabi, written in Babylon around 1750 before the birth of Christ, contained laws about slavery. In ancient Egypt, slavery existed by the time of the Old Kingdom, around 2600 before the birth of Christ. In the Indus Valley civilization, written records are limited, but archaeological evidence from around 2500 before the birth of Christ suggests a social hierarchy. In ancient China, slavery was practiced during the Shang dynasty, starting around 1600 before the birth of Christ. In ancient Israel, slavery was institutionalized in society and law. In ancient Greece, slavery was a widespread and normalized institution. Sparta used a distinct system involving the Helots, who were native populations of Messenia and Laconia conquered by Sparta. In the Roman Republic and later the Roman Empire, slavery was central to the economy and legal system. In ancient Africa, slavery was practiced long before contact with the Arab world or Europe. In the pre-Islamic Arabian Peninsula, slavery was widespread among tribal communities. During the expansion of the Islamic caliphates, enslaved people were taken from regions including Europe, Central Asia, and Africa. The trans-Saharan slave trade emerged as a major network by the 8th century after the birth of Christ. In East Africa, the Indian Ocean slave trade developed by the 9th century. In medieval Europe, slavery declined in the early Middle Ages, but did not disappear. The Byzantine Empire maintained slavery throughout its existence. In the Viking Age, Norse raiders captured and enslaved people during raids across Britain, Ireland, and the European mainland. In Russia, slavery coexisted with serfdom for centuries. The Mongol Empire, which emerged in the 13th century, enslaved large numbers of people during its conquests. Slaves included artisans, laborers, and soldiers. From the 13th to the 15th century, Italian city-states such as Venice and Genoa traded slaves from the Balkans, the Black Sea region, and North Africa. In the mid-15th century, Portugal began exploring the West African coast. Spain followed with the use of enslaved Africans in the Canary Islands. The transatlantic slave trade became one of the largest forced migration systems in human history. The Middle Passage was the transatlantic journey from Africa to the Americas. Once in the Americas, enslaved people were sold in markets and forced to work in plantations, mines, and households. In British North America, slavery was established in the early 17th century. By the 18th century, the transatlantic slave trade had transported over 10 million Africans to the Americas. The Haitian Revolution began in 1791. Enslaved people in the French colony of Saint-Domingue rose against plantation owners. The revolt evolved into a full-scale war. In 1808, the United States passed a federal law banning the importation of enslaved Africans. However, the domestic slave trade within the United States remained legal. In 1833, the British Parliament passed the Slavery Abolition Act. In 1843, slavery was banned in British India. In 1848, France abolished slavery in all its remaining colonies. In the United States, the abolitionist movement gained momentum in the early 1800s. It included speeches, newspapers, pamphlets, and public protests. In 1861, the American Civil War began. The conflict centered largely on the issue of slavery. In Brazil, slavery continued after the abolition of slavery in North America. In Russia, serfdom was the dominant form of unfree labor. In the Ottoman Empire, slavery continued through the 19th century. In Africa, European colonial powers began suppressing slavery during the period known as the Scramble for Africa. In the Middle East and North Africa, slavery persisted into the 20th century. In South Asia, slavery was banned under British rule in the mid-19th century. In Qing dynasty China, slavery included hereditary and bonded labor. In North Korea, forced labor is used extensively in prison camps and for state construction projects. In the Soviet Union, forced labor was a feature of the Gulag system. In the 20th century, international organizations began to develop legal frameworks to combat slavery and forced labor. The United Nations was established in 1945. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948, declared that no one shall be held in slavery or servitude. The International Labour Organization, founded in 1919, worked to eliminate forced labor worldwide. Modern slavery includes forced labor, human trafficking, debt bondage, forced marriage, and child exploitation. In Southeast Asia, modern slavery includes trafficking for domestic work, fishing, and construction. In the Middle East, the kafala system regulates migrant labor in countries such as Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates. In Africa, modern slavery includes child labor, domestic servitude, and exploitation in mining. In Latin America, forced labor has been found in agriculture, logging, and domestic service. In Europe and North America, human trafficking affects both local populations and migrants. In 2000, the United Nations adopted the Palermo Protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons. The Global Slavery Index, published by the Walk Free Foundation, estimates that over 40 million people live in modern slavery. Efforts to combat modern slavery include education, legal reform, survivor support, and consumer awareness.